Time to begin. You tear open the thin film around the puzzle box and scatter thousands of pieces on the floor. The image on the box promises a beautiful landscape or a beautiful painting, however, what lies in front of you is chaos. Most people immediately dive in, trying to connect random pieces or force connections that don't exist, and as this happens, frustration grows. There are too many pieces, nothing is connecting, and all of a sudden you realize just how long this whole process is going to take. Soon after, all the pieces go back to the box where they're gonna catch dust for the next decade or so. Once again, another abandoned project. Now, to be honest, for the longest time I didn't enjoy puzzles. It took way too long, things didn't seem to connect, and overall it was a very frustrating experience. However, that is until my girlfriend, who really enjoys puzzles, showed me a better way. She separated the straight-edged pieces from the pile and began connecting them, the frame. Within minutes, what was once an overwhelming mess became a defined workspace. Now, this border created boundaries, which essentially turns an infinite possibility of random pieces connecting into a structured challenge. Because now inside this frame, every piece had context. What seemed impossible became inevitable. And that's when I realized that this isn't about puzzles, it's about everything. Your goals, your productivity, your focus, all of them are suffering from the same fatal flaw. They're lacking a frame. And the cost of this approach is greater than you realize. We're all chasing that elusive flow state. That state where hours turn into minutes and you see the work in front of you completely disappear as you become a productivity machine. No writer's block, no compulsive email checking, no battling against your own mind. Just pure, focused productivity. Now, if I had to guess, you're not in control of when this happens. For most people, they can only access this state when they're backed into a corner. The presentation due tomorrow morning, the client deliverable already past deadline, or the project that absolutely cannot be delayed another day. Suddenly you're in flow, but you're also stressed, overworked, and facing a mountain of work that seems absolutely impossible to finish. So then the question becomes, why can you do it close to the deadline, but not on every other day? Luckily, the answer to this is very straightforward, and even though the way to get there is not, we'll get to it in a second. Now, when a deadline approaches and is looming, all of a sudden your work has a frame. This frame creates, first, immediate clarity about what matters, second, natural elimination of distractions, and thirdly, a defined space that your brain can actually work with. The deadline doesn't create productivity, it creates the constraints that allow productivity to flow. It's paradoxical, because to achieve this state of focus and flow and productivity that we're after, especially with this difficult but rewarding work, we are forced to set these limitations and these constraints to play within. Just think of it like water. For our best efforts to flow, we need a channel that has been dug out for them to flow through. Without edges, we have infinite possibilities but minimal progress. The most productive people aren't those with complete freedom. They are the ones that, before panic arrives, create the right limitations and the right frames and right borders to be able to play within. They build a frame first, by choice, rather than having it imposed by circumstance. In my own personal experience, where I felt this the most, beyond a shadow of a doubt, was with my writing. Specifically the weekly newsletters that I always write, because in the past, what I would do is I would think of some idea, very vague, and I would just start writing. And I'd be like, okay, I have to get this done around like Friday, and then I have to edit, and then, I wouldn't even think about all the other steps. But what would happen is that if it was a good week, or I was a bit more inspired, it would be great, because it would just flow, no problem, everything very smooth. But if I was a bit less inspired, or if it was a topic that seemed a bit more complicated than I initially thought, then things would go very sour very quickly. I'll start getting very overwhelmed. Nothing would seem to connect, one section with the other. It would take longer than I thought. And then I would either have to delay and not send the newsletter, or send something I was not happy with. Overall, it just made work very complicated because, again, I had a lot of freedom and sometimes that was good. But in the general context of things, especially if I was looking at in a year-by-year context, it just didn't work. And so a much better way, and I was even going to say something before, is that because a big problem is that a lot of questions weren't answered. And so a better way is, like we talked about here, to have a frame. And so it makes sense in a practical sense. What this meant to me was just answering these questions. So what is it specifically about? How long is it going to be? What are going to be the different sections? How do they connect with each other? What type of research am I going to have to do? What day am I going to be used to edit and then to define the title? All of these things. And by defining them and clearly understanding them and scheduling them accordingly, it makes everything so much easier. Because obviously you have to find that sweet spot, because in the beginning, I got into the point where it was a bit too much. But once you find the sweet spot, it is just like we're talking about. You have your frame to build your puzzle, but then you can play within it to play and actually have fun and flow and be in that good state that you are after. And what it ensures is that a big point here too is that because you've scheduled sort of the main things, and okay, if I do these things like that by the end of the week or by the deadline, they will all be ready. Excuse me. Then your brain is free to kind of let go of that permanent control and be like, okay, that's done. So let's just focus on the work ahead. We don't have to stress about what's coming after. We already did that. We already understand that if we do these steps, we will get there. And so this to me was absolutely transforming to how I approach not only my writing, but a lot of other tasks in a more micro sense here of doing these things. And so obviously for me, these are the questions I answer. For you, those questions are going to be different, but no doubt that you have to answer them. And you know it, and your mind knows it too. And that's why so often when you try to sit down, it doesn't work, because those questions are left unanswered. Yet, that is not all. Because even though you have to answer these questions for whatever task that you're going to do, these are more in the micro sense of things. Because in the broader sense of the whole puzzle, if we look at, in my case, the writing, that is one of the sections of the puzzle. And just because I've completed that corner or whatever it may be, there's still the rest of it. And here's where I want to introduce you to the concept of the keystone element. Now, in a puzzle, most of them, not all, but for our example here, let's take one of those. There's usually a big or a main sort of object or monument or person in the painting. It's usually much easier to identify than the sky around it or the grass around it, or things that are very similar. This one really, really stands out. And so it becomes not only easier to take these pieces and separate them, but you also know that because it is a big surface and because it is easier to complete, and often is in a strategic location, you know that once you complete this, everything else becomes easier. Because if I complete one of the corners, okay, it helps me a bit, but there's so much of the unknown still of the puzzle, and it's still very difficult. If I can complete this one section in the middle of the statue, then I have a lot of connection points. Maybe here there's this tree to the left, and maybe to the right there's this river on the background, and then a lot of things that you can connect to. And so it makes then after that your job very easy to separate the remaining pieces, remaining sections, then complete them easier. So all of this to say that in your work, there's also tasks or a task usually that has disproportional importance on how much effort you put in compared to how much it's going to give you. So to me, that's the writing, because from this big newsletter, then I can do these YouTube videos, and then I can, kind of chunk it down and create the posts for Instagram. And it really just makes everything easier. And not only easier to complete, but to begin. Because then I'm not just looking at a blank canvas. I can look at what I've already created, what I've already done, and it just facilitates everything. And this is something you also have to identify for your work, hobby, project, whatever it may be. What is that keystone element? What is the one task that, if completed or when completed, makes everything around it easier? If you are thinking that everything is equally important and that all these tasks are equally important, I have to tell you, and I didn't want to dive into this again, that they cannot be equally important, because you can only do one thing good, at least, at a time. One thing at a time. That means that none of these are equally important, because you have to do them in order of priority. And what you're gonna realize that if you look at your calendar in the past, that you're gonna realize that a lot of days you didn't complete all of it. And yet things were fine. Maybe they didn't progress as you wanted, but they, if you're still here, they were fine. What that shows you is that some of these things, even if it's not optimal, they can go being undone. And so because of that, I really urge you to look at what you're actually doing, not what you want to do, and see what I'm actually doing every day and what am I not doing every day. And what are the actual priorities for me to do? Because the goal, at least for me, and I would think for you too, is that for your time to continuously keep increasing in value, so that for the same amount of time you keep investing, you get more out of it. Whatever that is, better writing, more money, more purpose, whatever that may be for you. And at some point, you have to let go of control and really look at some of these tasks that perhaps you have to do them and they have to be done, but they don't have to be done by you. Let's say if in a business, you can delegate. You don't have to be the one replying to all of the customer support emails, for example. Things like this. I'm not going to dive too much into it. But there are things like this that you can just delegate, or you can automate and spend like an afternoon automating, and then it's kind of taken care of for the most part. And the thing is that a lot of them you can just remove completely because you're kind of holding on to this control. Perhaps someone told you that you should be doing this, or in your mind you think you should do this because everyone does it. Remember, there are no rules for anything. All the things that we do now and best practice and all these things were at some point not done. And then someone introduced it and then we began doing them. So be critical about it. Don't just remove for removing, but don't just keep for the sake of keeping. Be critical about it, observe it, because the only truly limited thing that you have is your time. Everything else, can exponentially progress and can go to levels we can't imagine, and you can get it back and lose it, all that. Time is the only thing that you cannot get back. So please, excuse me here, I urge you to be very, 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 how do you say in English? Strict, if you are to be strict, is with how you spend that time. A lot of times, again, I would argue that you're just not structuring things correctly. But a lot of times, if that is happening, I would argue that you're just not going for the right opportunity.